Hello, and welcome to ImpactoAZ, a podcast dedicated to centering Latinx voices on the issues of the day. I'm Jonathan Higuera, your host, and I'm here along with my co host Juan Rodriguez, who also doubles as our executive producer. Good to see you, Juan. Today's guest is Tom Prezelski, a senior political advisor to Rural Arizona Action, an advocacy organization dedicated to issues that include housing, clean energy, voting rights, and water policy. Welcome, Tom.
Howdy.
Good to see you. You have quite a resume here, and I'm so glad you're with us today so we can pick your brains on some of these issues that you've worked on. I didn't even touch on some things like you serving 3 terms in our House of Representatives in the State House, other positions you've held with the Pascua Yaqui tribe and Tohono O'odham Nation. But I hope that we can weave that into today's conversation so people will get a real sense of the breadth of your experience and what you're bringing to the table for us here in Arizona. So one thing I noticed that maybe we can start out with you sharing a little bit more about who is Rural Arizona Action, what is Rural Arizona Action, and what are some of the things you do? What are some of the big projects you take on?
Well, Rural Arizona Action and then the nonprofit arm, Rural Arizona Engagement, were founded, right before COVID came down by some activists in Pinal County who were concerned about the lack of progressive organizing in the rural space. And so we're doing a lot of organizing work related to basically progressive-minded people of color in the rural space, the issues that you mentioned, voting rights, groundwater issues, other environmental clean energy issues, where we're really not hearing a perspective of a lot of working class people and people of color in those rural spaces. So that's what we're focused on elevating.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, when you say rural, which communities are rural and how do you define rural?
Oh yeah, that's kind of a moving target. The one thing we always agree about is that if it's outside of metropolitan Phoenix, then we call it rural. So though we don't do a lot of work in
But that would
metropolitan,
be Tucson as well? That would
it
mean
depends on the
Tucson,
issue.
you're considered Tucson rural as well.
That
Okay.
would depend on the issue. But
Interesting.
generally, if it's outside the metropolitan areas, we're calling it rural. I think Tucson shares a lot of issues with rural Arizona, although a lot of folks in, Douglas and Parker and places like that would probably not agree, but we do share some issues.
Okay. And one big issue, as you mentioned to me when we talked previously, that you work on is water policy and specifically groundwater policy. That seems to be your area of emphasis right now. And water is always a topic here in Arizona, where it's coming from. I learned something just the other day, and I think this is correct, that Arizonans probably use more groundwater than they do Colorado River water, which is something I wasn't aware of. Does that sound true to you in your area of expertise?
I think it depends on how they're making those measurements. Certainly outside of Tucson and Phoenix, people are relying more on groundwater than Colorado River water or surface water in general. And that's part of the problem, is that basically if you look at the kind of the CAP corridor, more or less pressed to the border, those folks generally have access to CAP water, and they're also regulated under the Groundwater
Did you
Management
say
Act.
CAP? Okay.
Yeah, yeah, the
Just in
Central
case we
Arizona
don't
Public.
have people from Arizona listening. Okay. And that's our canal
Oh,
system,
yeah.
right? From the Colorado River.
Yes, that is the water from the Colorado River. And so
Okay.
so basically Tucson to Phoenix is taken care of with Colorado River water for the most part. And then outside of that, you have these communities that are very dependent on groundwater. So they're very vulnerable to issues of people from outside those communities moving in to do very intensive water dependent agriculture, investors who want to basically bank water for their own purposes. and that sort of thing. And because they don't have the same protections that we have in Tucson and Phoenix, those communities are particularly impacted because they don't, in some cases, they don't know where their water is going to come from, even in the short term.
So they may have a well on their plot of land, but sometimes that well may run dry if the big agricultural firm or dairy farm happens to be pumping a lot of groundwater. Is that correct? So if that's the situation, what does rural Arizona Action do in those cases, or advocate for at least?
Yeah, and the problem that we see a lot is that some of these big farms, most of these big farms are actually they're not locally owned. And in many cases, they're not even hiring local people to work in these operations. So there's a lot of the impact. They're not even seeing an economic benefit from these large operations. Like for instance, famously, the thing that keeps coming up is the Fondamonte alfalfa farms in La Paz County, where they're owned by a foreign corporation. They don't employ a lot of people, and residents of La Paz County are seeing their wells go dry. They're seeing, and if their wells aren't going dry, they're having to invest tens of thousands of dollars in deepening their existing wells because in some cases their wells have dropped tens of or hundreds of feet.
And as I understand it, drilling is a very expensive proposition. I don't know how much it is per yard or foot or however you measure it, but I understand it can get very pricey.
Yeah, the settlement that Chris Mays just entered into with Riverview, which was the dairy that was very aggressively mining water in Cochise County, it includes, I can't think of the number off the top of my head, it includes a few $1 million basically to go to residents of the Sulphur Springs Valley who need to put those improvements in their well. So that just gives you an idea of what kind of economic impact they can have on their neighbors.
Now, I haven't read the fine print of that agreement, but does it require that dairy farm to use less water, or are they still able? Because I keep reading how rural Arizona groundwater law is full of deregulation, no regulations in place to prevent people from doing these kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that there is almost no regulation of groundwater in rural Arizona. And that's one of the things I keep wanting to bring up because people keep saying, "Oh, this is about the Saudis investing in Paz County. This is about the Saudis or Californians coming in." And it's like it's not about the Saudis. It's not about Californians. It's about the fact that we just don't have regulation, and so people from outside the state kind of target these communities for this really aggressive groundwater extraction. So, when you say there are loopholes in existing regulations, if only there were existing regulations where there could be loopholes. There is very little that can be done in rural Arizona in terms of regulating groundwater. The governor has been very aggressive in creating new active management areas, basically putting the level of regulation that we see in Tucson and Phoenix in some of these areas in other parts of the state. So far, it's a Wilcox area. Douglas already did it on their own. And then Renegras, which is it's kind of a very sparsely populated area in La Paz County that's seen a lot of aggressive groundwater withdrawal. So the governor's been able to do that under the existing law. However, there are issues with the way that those regulations are made because in Tucson and Phoenix and Pinal County and Prescott, where these active management areas were already in place, they made those back in 1980 with urban problems and suburban problems in mind. Once you start expanding those to rural areas, it kind of it leads to issues of what are we going to do for, let's say, the farmer who's now farming alfalfa, which is a very water intensive crop, and wants to switch it to let's say, wine grapes or lavender or some other crop that uses a lot less water and yields a lot more profit, do our current regulations accommodate that? And our current laws accommodate that? So that's one of the big questions that's being debated in the legislature, as well as at the Department of Water Resources, and that's something that we've been part of.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, is this something that the legislature needs to address, or can some remedies just come from executive orders or regulatory agencies stepping up their game?
Yeah, the legislature does need to address it. We've had on the table, I think it's been nearly 7 years, kind of a Rural Groundwater Management Act parallel to the regular Groundwater Management Act that takes the rural economy and rural water use and the rural lifestyle into account, and and to address the specific problems of groundwater regulation in rural areas. Unfortunately, because of opposition from, let's just say, the old time farm lobby, those proposals have never gone anywhere, even though they have really broad bipartisan support. And when I say bipartisan support, I'm not just talking about the legislature. I'm talking about local officials in all over the state. We're talking about mega conservatives in places like Mojave and La Paz County who are saying we need to regulate our groundwater, and those efforts have been stopped at the legislature. And so what's going on is that the governor's office has gotten frustrated with this and is taking the aggressive action that they're taking over there, because there is some, they're looking for ways under the existing law to start addressing the problems in rural Arizona. One thing we're hoping.
And why wouldn't the farm? Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things we're hoping is that there is some legislative tweaks to address the problem that I mentioned earlier, with perhaps some flexibility for people who want to grow these high value, low water use crops like grapes or lavender or whatever, and otherwise encourage more responsible use.
And when you say farm lobby, I think of farmers and rural folks, but really, are we talking about major corporations and agribusiness that would be against these type of regs? Is that the lobby that you're referring to?
Well, yeah, when you're talking about organizations like the Farm Bureau, they seem to be speaking largely for corporate agriculture. A lot of the people who we've been working with tend to be what we call, what I guess the term now is generational farmers, family farmers who've been on the land for multiple generations, who are very concerned about water conservation, very concerned about trying to work with their neighbors on making a more sensible water policy. And that's one of the things that's really sad about. Yeah, one of the things that's sad about, like in Cochise County, we're working with a farmer who actually farms chili peppers, which is kind of interesting. And he's told us stories about conflicts. Suddenly, you have these this big agribusiness moves in, and suddenly people are fighting with each other, and that wasn't happening before. So this is actually breaking communities and stuff.
Okay. Now, you served in the legislature for 3 terms. I don't know what the last year is you served. What year would that have been?
2009 was my last year.
2009. Okay, so we're going back a ways. But was this something that was on the radar back then as well, or is this a more recent revival? Because I know about the Saudi firm or people who were growing alfalfa for their horses. That's the famous case you referred to that everyone seems to know about and garnered the most backlash. But when you were in the legislature, was this one of the issues that you worked on?
No, and I'll tell you, there's some interesting reasons for why it wasn't an issue when I was there. First of all, when I was in the legislature, I served with one of the top water attorneys in Arizona, which is interesting because she never got to work on water issues. while she was in the legislature. She served one term. But I actually remember an incident where there was a bill that was moving to address some issues about water because someone was saying that there was a kind of a legislator with a libertarian streak who was saying that if you have a well on your property, that's your water. Now, of course, we know that that violates basic geology. It's not just, not just a matter of law, but a matter of science that no, that's not your water. The speaker at the time, Jake
Because
Flake.
the well water goes beyond the property lines, right?
Oh,
Because the well water
yeah, because you're all
goes
drawing water.
beyond that property line. Yeah.
It, it's like on Happy Days where two of the characters are sharing a milkshake and they're both drinking from different straws. It's the same thing. But
I'm sorry to get so basic on
what?
you, but some of these things
Oh no,
I
no,
really need a
that's
grounding in, or
yeah,
our audience might need a grounding
yeah,
in.
and that probably is something that when you've been when you have a degree in geology like I do, and you've been working in this issue specifically, you just assume everyone knows this stuff. So it's great that you're asking me. But the speaker of the House, of the Arizona House at the time was Jake Flake, who of course is from a very old ranching family, and he would not allow
Right.
anything related to water
Snowflake.
to move forward. Yeah, of Snowflake, Arizona. Yeah, he wouldn't allow anything to move forward, and he told me that he believed that the Groundwater Management Act was so fragile that you didn't want to mess with any of it, or the whole thing would come unraveled. So that was what was
Okay.
going on then. About 10 years ago, things changed a lot. Our esteemed previous governor, Governor Ducey, decided to kind of change the mission statement of not only the Arizona Department of Water Resources, but a number of agencies at the state to make them more quote unquote customer friendly. And ADWR was just not doing a lot of the work they needed to do as far as regulating water. The first day that, the first day of the state address that Governor Hobbs had, she talked about all these reports that were not released while Ducey was governor that talked about how much peril our water situation was in. So there was that going on. There were also some other changes in the law that allowed a lot of these investors to come in and start just being very aggressive with withdrawing water. That was not happening when I was in the legislature. I mean, of course, things weren't perfect, but we didn't see that level of kind of agribusiness and investment and I guess kind of hedge funds and venture capital moving in and trying to profit off of our water.
It's kind of ironic that you would come to Arizona to get water, considering our
Yeah,
status as a desert region, arid region. I know not always, not completely the whole state, but a large part of it pretty arid. But if you see an
yeah,
opportunity to go
yeah.
in and get water, groundwater, and use it, you probably will take that opportunity if you have the money.
Yeah, that's why a lot of us were leery when he said Arizona is open for business, and it's like, well, this is the kind of business we got open to, so that's a problem.
So tell me, it sounds like rural, your firm, your nonprofit, your advocacy organization does even more than water issues. I was looking at your website. You do voter issues. You do other, I don't know, maybe environmental. I had it written down here, but what are some of the other topics that are important? I would think maybe heading into these 2026 midterm elections, you guys might be active on that front as well these days.
Yeah, well, as far as voting issues, that actually I've been talking about that a lot in the last few days. That's actually interesting because it really tells you how important it is to have rural advocacy. There are organizations like, let's say, Lucha, Mi Familia Vota. Those organizations are doing a lot of great work, but their focus is largely on metropolitan Phoenix, but also metropolitan Tucson. And once you get outside those areas, you have a different set of issues that are not being talked about unless you have an organization like ours. Like, for instance, there's some legislation moving through to limit, to basically eliminate vote centers and change the way precincts are drawn. And one of the things that, and of course, this is a suburban legislator who's saying this, and one of the things people in the suburbs just don't get about rural Arizona is that it is actually physically hard to vote sometimes when you live in a more remote and under-resourced community. Like in San Luis, there's the problem of there's just one main arterial in the whole town, and there's certain hours where that arterial is clogged with traffic because of the agricultural business and the migrant workers going back and forth. And that makes it very difficult for people to vote. They don't have, in some cases, they don't really have addresses. Even the folks who have a home don't necessarily have a regular address. So, there's communities like that, and you really need to bring that up in the discussion. And one interesting thing that's come up, an issue which I was aware of, but I didn't really appreciate it till I started doing this work, was in a lot of rural communities, especially in tribal areas, there aren't a lot of public buildings. In fact, there are very few. There are very few public buildings, and even fewer
Like
public
City
buildings.
Hall and public libraries and the sort.
Yeah, and there are even fewer buildings that are adequate to use for polling place because there are actually regulations about what buildings you can use for a polling place. You can't just put one in someone's house. So there's in one community on the Navajo Reservation, Chinle, and I'm sure this is not the only place where this happens. There are so few public buildings that two precincts actually have their polling place in the same physical building. So on election day, there are two lines for voters. And if you get in the wrong line, you will be kicked out and you have to go to the back of the other line. That is a problem you don't have in the suburbs. And I think sometimes folks in the legislature really don't appreciate that. They don't understand that. They don't understand that these communities are different. So one of the things that I really love about this work is I get to say, hey, wait a minute, not every place is like Oro Valley or Scottsdale. These are the problems they have in these towns.
People are dealing with. Juan, did you had a question?
Yeah, it's kind of a two-parter. But first of all, I want to, in transparency and a disclaimer type thing, I worked with Tom on in Rural Arizona Action last cycle as a regional field director there in Tucson. And, I consider Tucson itself a metropolitan area. But you go like within a mile of downtown, it starts to get very rural. My teams were up in Marana and Oro Valley, and some of those communities are extremely rural. And even in the outskirts of Tucson, it's considered rural. But my question, the two different questions, and I don't mean to go back to the water issue, but, I understand, that agriculture companies, especially corporate agriculture, are growing, the lavender and the grapes and other agriculture products. Are Arizona consumers having access to that, or is all that being shipped out of state?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah, it kind of depends. When we're talking about a lot of notoriously with the Fondemonte, which was the Arab investors company, they were literally taking that alfalfa and shipping it out of state because it's illegal to grow alfalfa in the Arabian Peninsula. So that's what was going on. There is a generally growing wine industry in Cochise and Santa Cruz County, and they are doing a lot of of outreach, a lot of events, a lot of marketing in Arizona to build up the branding of Arizona wines. Okay. So yeah, there are these crops. Not only they benefit Arizonans because number one, Arizonans are employed. There's some tourism attached to it, so it's a real potential economic engine. Wilcox is changing a lot because of the wine industry.
And my second question, what's going on right now nationwide, and you hear it in the news constantly, it's like the new boogeyman, is AI centers moving into communities and using all the water. Now, is that going to happen, or is that happening already in Arizona? And are the community organizations prepared or ready for this? And are they going to push back on some level, in your opinion?
Okay, well, the data center issue is actually really interesting because of the players on either side and how it is completely unpredictable when a data center moves into a certain location, who's going to end up on one side or the other of that issue. I'm not going to name names, but there is a very progressive mayor of a small community here in Arizona who has said that they're open to data centers. I did not expect that person to say that. But in other places, like, as I mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work in Mojave County with some very MAGA-oriented elected officials there. They've been very aggressive against data centers. They know that they are a potential target for data center development, and so they're putting some regulations in place, very similar to the ones that we recently put in Tucson, and even kind of ordered their economic development department to not pursue data centers. So they're not, so they're not going to have their economic development people go out and say, hey, you can locate here, we'll help you out. So that's not going to, so that's a big impact. But I know that elected officials around the state, Yavapai being a big one, Coconino being a big one, they are being very aggressive and proactive about trying to, at the very least, mitigate the impact of data center development. There's some stuff going on in Cochise County. Right? It's about protecting water, also
and the energy grid.
Yeah, the electrical capacity. A lot of these places simply do not have the utility capacity to power these things. It was an interesting issue in Pinal County because where they wanted to locate the data center was in an area outside of Eloy that really wasn't getting a lot of resources from the county. And the data center developers came in and said, we'll pave your roads, we'll provide you with sheriff substation, all this other stuff. And, it's hard to argue against that. But there's also all these other impacts that I don't think were being considered. But they seem to, the impact on the electrical grid, they're actually contributing to that. But it's an issue that's going to vary considerably from place to place. I think that the big thing that's largely not entered the discussion is the fact that we're talking about an industry that is constantly seeking out efficiency. And at some point in the very near future, maybe 10, 20 years down the road, we're going to see that these data centers are no longer necessary because they've come up with a cheaper and more efficient way to do the same thing. And so here we go. We built a 3,000-acre facility in Pinal County, and there is no use for it. It's just an empty concrete shell.
Hollowed-out infrastructure.
So that's something.
Tom, on your ethnic background, being half Polish, half Mexican, that combination would not be uncommon in Chicago. uh, I knew plenty of people who
No,
were.
well, when I was working at the Tohono Nation, we had a bunch of consultants come in to talk to us about transportation safety planning. And one of them was a guy named John Zogby, or no, sorry, Jack Zogby, which is a name that you're familiar with.
Yes.
And Jack Zogby came up to me. I saw he had a name tag, Jack Zogby. And he comes up to me and he starts speaking to me in Polish. But to talk to us about, I don't speak Polish, I'm Mexican. And so he starts speaking to me in Spanish. So I said to him, how does a guy with an Arab name like Zogby know Polish and Spanish? And he said, how'd you know I'm Arab? I said, because there's a very famous Arab American political activist named Zogby. And he said, oh yeah, he's my cousin. And then he explained to me that he was from Hamtramck. And apparently in Hamtramck, the Mexicans, the Arabs, and the Poles all went to the same church.
Yeah.
And so they all grew up together. They all knew each other. They learned languages. They ate the same food. So it's one of those things that we just don't. You have to be in these communities to appreciate that stuff.
Yes, yes. And you're also a recognized award-winning author. Can you talk a little about that, about your book and what it's about and where people can get it?
Oh, yes. The award I got from Edward James Olmos, by the way.
Yes.
Because that's his nonprofit that gives those awards. It's called California Lancers. And it's about a unit of Mexican-American cavalrymen during the Civil War. It's available from University of Oklahoma Press, and you can also get it in usual places like Amazon. I got interested in the topic. There's some of my historical interest really goes back to when I was growing up, and my Nana, when there were big family events, there would be all these old cowboys who would visit my Nana. People who were friends of the family when it back on the ranch on the San Pedro Valley and in Vail. And these cowboys that I would meet when I was growing up were always Mexicans or Indians. But when I would watch Western movies on TV, the cowboys were never Mexicans or Indians. And that always bugged me. So one of the things that when I'm doing my research in history, I'm always looking for those people that kind of counter the narrative of Anglo, the Anglo cowboys and such who settled the West, and it's like no, it was way more complicated. There were a lot of different ethnic groups, including a lot of Mexican Americans. And so when I found out about this unit of cavalrymen, I discovered that there was absolutely nothing written about them. They were mentioned in various places, but no one ever actually said, okay, this is how they were recruited, this is who they were, this is what they did, and this is where they served. No one had done that. And so I went and I said, okay, well, so what were these guys doing? They were from all these, they were vaqueros, who were basically from the big ranches in Central and Southern California. And they were cavalrymen because, of course, they were supposed to be Californians. The so-called native Californians, the Californios, were supposed to be the finest horsemen on the planet. I'm not sure if that's true, what he compared them to. But so these guys were... They were in the Army during the Civil War, mostly in California. They were doing, I guess, what amounts to kind of law and order sort of duties, kind of enforcing what amounted to martial law in Civil War era California, because California was in the Union, but there were always these kind of Confederate militias and stuff rising up and causing trouble. They were taking down bandits, and and that sort of thing. And then as the war came to a close, they were sent to Arizona for two reasons. Number one, they needed more troops to fight the Apaches. And number two, that was at about the time that when the French-backed imperial government in Mexico had taken over, and they had actually at that point invaded Sonora. So the U.S. government was very concerned that the French and the imperialist Mexicans would cross over into Arizona, which they did on one occasion. And so the native cavalry was there to basically patrol the border, and on at least two occasions actually crossed the border into Sonora to confront the imperial troops. And
Wow,
it was
that
was
awesome,
interesting
Reed.
because I hope it is.
Yeah.
And that's interesting for a number of reasons, but one of them is that it's a reminder that different people joined the Union Army for different reasons. Mm-hmm. And in California, it was about, number one, poverty, because a lot of those big ranches, as they were breaking up, these cowboys, these vaqueros, had no work. Mm. But also kind of this loyalty to not only the United States, but also to the Republic in Mexico. And people actually saw support for the Mexican Republic and support for the Union to be one and the same. That somehow it was absolutely essential to support the Union so that a Republican government could be restored in Mexico. And that was quite interesting when I found that.
Tom, this has been a fascinating discussion with you. I think we've learned a lot today, not only about water issues and voting issues and rural Arizona issues, but also on this beautiful history of the California Lancers. That would be a good read for people to go out and find out the true West, and how the true West was, the history of it and how it was settled. Because you're right, there was a lot of mixing of Indian, Mexican, American. It's really good stuff. But with that, I think I'm going to have to close out the show now. So thank you, everybody. And if you enjoyed the content we brought you here today on ImpactoAZ, please remember to subscribe and follow us. That's the only way we can keep presenting content like this and giving it to you. So once again, thank you for joining us today, and thank our guest, Tom Prezelski. Good day.